My sister bragged about snagging our $2 million beach estate for $1. They love me more. She texted. I replied, read the fine print. The next day, my lawyer called. I was sitting in my corner office on the 24th floor of one of the most ruthless corporate law firms in downtown Boston, watching the heavy rain hammer against the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was past 9 o'clock at night. Most of my colleagues had gone home to their families hours ago, leaving me entirely alone with a cold cup of black coffee and a massive stack of complex merger and acquisition files. I am 34 years old, and my entire adult life has been built on order, logic, and relentless, unforgiving hard work. I do not entertain drama. I do not engage in chaotic emotional outbursts. And I certainly do not let the endless, exhausting circus of my family distract me from my career trajectory. But then, my phone vibrated violently against the polished mahogany desk. The screen illuminated the dim room, cutting through the shadows and displaying a name I usually ignored for my own peace of mind. It was Cassandra, my 30-year-old sister. I picked up the phone slowly, fully expecting another desperate plea for a short-term loan, or perhaps a link to her latest doomed business venture that she expected me to fund. Instead, a high-resolution photo loaded onto the screen. It was Cassandra, wearing an incredibly expensive linen dress and oversized designer sunglasses, despite the completely overcast weather. She was posing triumphantly on the wraparound cedar wood porch of Grandpa Harrison's coastal estate in Newport. In her hand, she was holding up a cheap, novelty oversized key, flashing a brilliant, perfectly practiced camera-ready smile. Beneath the photograph was a text message that she had clearly spent a considerable amount of time crafting to inflict the maximum amount of emotional damage. It read, "Mom and Dad just gifted me the estate. $2 million worth of prime real estate for exactly $1. They finally recognized who actually appreciates family history and who will take care of it. Hope you are not too jealous of my new summer home." I read the words again. $1. $2 million of beachfront legacy, a property steeped in decades of our family history, signed away for a single piece of pocket change. A normal person in my position might have screamed. A normal sister might have thrown her phone across the room, burst into uncontrollable tears of betrayal, or immediately called her parents to furiously demand an explanation for this blatant theft. I did absolutely none of those things. I simply leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, took a slow, deliberate sip of my terribly watered-down coffee, and let a cold, genuinely peaceful smile spread across my face. I did not feel shock, because this was not a surprise to me. I did not feel heartbroken, because my heart had been thoroughly hardened against my parents a very long time ago. What I felt in that exact moment was a profound, deeply satisfying sense of absolute vindication. For 6 grueling months, I had been watching them maneuver in the shadows. I had been tracking their quiet little conversations, waiting patiently for them to make a fatal legal mistake. And Cassandra, in her infinite vanity and desperate need to gloat to the sister she always secretly envied, had just handed me the physical proof of their execution. She thought she had won the ultimate prize. She thought she had finally cemented her status as the undisputed, untouchable favorite daughter. She had absolutely no idea that she had just triggered a hidden legal trap that would tear her financial life down to the very foundation. I calmly swiped down on my phone screen and tapped the crescent moon icon, putting my device on Do Not Disturb mode. I could see 3 more text bubbles popping up on the lock screen, probably more photos of her parading around the property, claiming her new kingdom. Let her have her night, I thought to myself, turning back to my legal documents. Let her sleep in the master bedroom, listen to the ocean waves, and dream of her perfect, stolen life. Tomorrow morning, the legal reality was going to hit her like a runaway freight train. To truly understand why I felt absolutely zero guilt about what I was preparing to do to my own flesh and blood, you have to understand the deeply toxic dynamic of our household growing up. I was the eldest daughter, which in my parents' eyes simply meant I was the test run. I was the workhorse. I was the child expected to be completely independent, stoic, and self-sufficient from the moment I was old enough to walk. Cassandra, on the other hand, was the baby. She was the golden child. The fragile, beautiful little bird who needed constant protection, validation, and shielding from the harsh realities of the real world. But it went far beyond normal, everyday parental favoritism. It was a systemic, financial, and emotional draining of my resources to constantly fund her endless illusions of grandeur. The defining moment, the exact instance that built the permanent wall of ice between me and my parents, happened when I was exactly 18 years old. I had just been accepted into my absolute dream university, a highly prestigious pre-law program that I had spent 4 grueling years of high school grinding to achieve. I had straight-A grades, a perfect attendance record, and a resume full of extracurricular activities. I went to my father one evening to ask about the college fund they had supposedly been saving for me since the day I was born. My father could not even look me in the eye. He stared at his leather shoes and quietly muttered that the college fund was gone. All of it. Why? Because a few months prior, Cassandra, who was only 14 at the time, had stolen his car for a joyride with her older friends and crashed it straight into a neighbor's expensive glass greenhouse. The legal settlement to keep her out of the juvenile detention system and to pay for the massive property damages had wiped out 75% of my university money. When I cried, when I begged them to take out a personal loan so I would not lose my spot at the school, my mother just looked at me with cold irritation and said, "Valerie, you are incredibly smart. You will figure it out. Your sister needs us to protect her right now. Do not be so selfish and ungrateful." So, I figured it out. I worked 3 separate jobs. I constantly smelled like stale French fries and grease from my late-night diner shifts. I had chronic paper cuts on my fingers from my overnight shifts sorting books at the campus library, and I barely slept more than 4 hours a night for 4 consecutive years. I paid my own way, took on massive student loan debt, and fought tooth and nail for my corporate law degree. And what exactly did Cassandra do during those same years? She failed out of 2 different local community colleges because she refused to wake up for morning classes. But did my parents ever cut her off or force her to get a job? Absolutely not. They remortgaged their own residential house to fund her ridiculous, half-baked startup ideas. First, it was a luxury organic candle-making business that burned through $30,000 of their cash before she got bored of the smell of wax. Then, it was an influencer management agency where she was her own only client, constantly traveling to Bali and Paris on our parents' credit cards to take photos. They justified every single failure by saying she was simply finding herself and that she possessed a creative entrepreneurial spirit. They looked at my hard-earned corporate success as something cold and unfeeling, while they viewed her constant lazy failures as tragic strokes of bad luck. I learned very early on that loyalty in our family was strictly a one-way street. They would never, ever protect my interests. But thankfully, there was one person who saw completely through the dense fog of their delusions. Grandpa Harrison was my father's father, and he was an absolute force of nature. He was a retired naval architect, a man who built giant vessels to withstand the brutal ocean storms. He was a man who valued integrity, hard work, and quiet resilience over flashy appearances. In 1978, he bought a rugged plot of rocky land in Newport and built the massive coastal estate with his own 2 hands and a small crew of trusted carpenters. It was a true masterpiece of architecture, featuring thick cedar wood siding, massive stone fireplaces that reached the ceiling, and a gorgeous wraparound porch that faced the turbulent Atlantic Ocean. That house always smelled of sea salt, old leather-bound books, and safety. Every single summer, while my parents fawned over Cassandra's mediocre childhood achievements, Grandpa Harrison would quietly pull me aside. He taught me how to tie complex sailing knots. He taught me how to read the changing weather patterns in the clouds. And most importantly, he taught me how to play chess on the massive wooden board sitting in his sunroom. "Valerie," he used to tell me, his rough, calloused hand moving a wooden knight across the checkered board. "The loudest, most boastful person in the room is usually the weakest one. True strength is entirely quiet. You have to learn to let your opponent think they are winning the game. You let them make their bold, foolish, greedy moves, and you simply wait. You always think 5 moves ahead of their greed. He loved Cassandra, of course, because she was his granddaughter, but he was absolutely not blind to her deep-seated narcissism. Nor was he blind to the horrifying fact that my parents were raising a monster of pure entitlement. He saw how I was constantly pushed to the side. He saw the dark, exhausted bags under my eyes when I visited him during my brutal college years. When Grandpa Harrison passed away 5 years ago, it broke my heart into a million pieces. The official reading of his will was a predictable, quiet affair. He left minor cash sums to his children to cover immediate expenses, but the absolute crown jewel, the $2 million Newport estate, was placed directly into a family trust. My parents were formally named as the primary trustees, meaning they managed the property, paid the annual taxes, and maintained it for the family to use. Cassandra was absolutely thrilled, loudly assuming this meant she could throw endless summer parties there whenever she pleased. But what my parents did not know, what no one in the family knew except me, was that Grandpa Harrison had arranged a highly private, secret meeting with his lifelong lawyer, Mr. Hawthorne, just 1 month before his sudden death. In that meeting, Grandpa had set up a secondary, totally hidden layer to the trust document. He knew that eventually my parents would try to strip me of my rightful inheritance to fund Cassandra's endless, failing lifestyle. He knew they physically could not help themselves when it came to saving her. So, he built an impenetrable legal fortress around the estate, a fortress designed with a very specific, very lethal legal booby trap. A trap that I had been guarding silently for 5 long years. The grinding wheels of this massive betrayal did not start turning yesterday with that text message. They actually started exactly 6 months ago, on a perfectly mundane Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my apartment, reviewing a contract, when my mother called my cell phone. We usually only spoke once every few weeks, mostly superficial, exhausting conversations where she bragged endlessly about Cassandra's latest imaginary success, and I gave brief, non-committal answers just to keep the peace. But this specific phone call felt incredibly different. Her tone was overly sweet, laced with that distinct, nervous, high-pitched energy she always got whenever she was about to ask for something completely unreasonable. She started complaining loudly about the rising property taxes on the Newport estate. She mentioned how high the maintenance costs were getting for the cedar siding and how the roof might need replacing soon. And then, she casually dropped the line that made the tiny hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. "You know, Valerie," she sighed dramatically, "you are always so busy with your big corporate cases in the city. You never even have time to visit the beach house anymore. Do you even like going to the ocean these days?" It was a highly calculated, probing question. A clumsy, transparent attempt to gauge my current emotional attachment to the property. I did not confront her. I did not ask her what she was plotting. I just agreed mildly, saying work was indeed very demanding this quarter, and let her end the call thinking she had completely fooled me. The very moment I hung up the phone, my corporate lawyer instincts kicked into high gear. I did not trust them for a single second. I immediately logged onto my secure laptop, bypassed the standard public portals, and accessed the county clerk's advanced real estate database using my professional credentials. I pulled up the specific parcel number for Grandpa's estate. And right there, buried in the recent activity log, was the undeniable proof. A record clearly showing that an official, high-level property appraisal had been ordered by my father just 2 weeks prior. You absolutely do not order a formal appraisal on a family trust property unless you are trying to establish a baseline market value for an impending transfer or a quiet sale. The realization hit me hard, like a physical blow to the chest. They were planning to move the asset. They were actively planning to steal the $2 million house right out from under me, and they thought I was too stupid or too busy to notice. For a brief, painful moment, the old, familiar sting of parental rejection flared up hot in my chest. The terrified 18-year-old girl who lost her entire college fund was screaming at me from the inside to call them immediately, to yell, to demand they stop this theft. But then, I closed my eyes and remembered the heavy wooden chessboard. I remembered Grandpa Harrison's steady, calming voice telling me to let the opponent make their foolish move. I closed the database on my laptop. I calmly canceled my remaining afternoon meetings, locked my office door to ensure total privacy, and made a quiet, completely off-the-books phone call to an old friend of the family. I called Mr. Hawthorne. Mr. Hawthorne was a brilliant, incredibly sharp, old-school attorney. He always wore perfectly tailored tweed suits, drank expensive Scotch neat, and had been Grandpa Harrison's closest legal confidant for over 40 years. When I walked into his downtown office 6 months ago, smelling the familiar scent of old paper and leather bindings, and told him about the secret appraisal my father ordered, he did not look surprised in the slightest. He just looked deeply, profoundly sad. He slowly walked over to his massive, heavy iron filing cabinet, unlocked a secure fireproof drawer, and pulled out the original, unredacted trust document for the Newport estate. He silently slid the thick stack of papers across the heavy oak desk toward me. "Your grandfather anticipated exactly this, Valerie," Mr. Hawthorne said quietly, taking a seat across from me. "He knew your parents were designated as trustees, which gives them the legal power to manage the asset, pay the bills, and handle upkeep. But they're absolutely not the owners. You and Cassandra are the equal, untouchable beneficiaries." He reached out and pointed a wrinkled finger to a densely worded, heavily bolded paragraph buried on the 4th page of the document. "This is the anti-fraud provision. Grandpa insisted I draft it specifically for this exact, heartbreaking scenario. It strictly and undeniably prohibits the trustees from selling, gifting, or transferring ownership of the estate to anyone without the explicitly notarized, written consent of both beneficiaries." I read the dense legal jargon carefully, analyzing every single clause. "And what happens if they try to bypass my consent and push a transfer through anyway?" I asked, looking up at him. Mr. Hawthorne leaned forward, his eyes turning as hard and sharp as flint. "If they attempt to execute a fraudulent transfer, the provision is automatically and instantly triggered. The trust immediately strips your parents of their trustee status forever. They lose all legal control of the property. But more importantly, there is a severe punitive exile clause. Any party involved in the fraudulent attempt, meaning whoever tries to buy, sell, or accept the stolen property, is legally barred from stepping foot on the premises for 5 full years. It is an absolute lockout." I sat back in the heavy leather chair, completely absorbing the sheer, ruthless genius of Grandpa's foresight. Mr. Hawthorne softly offered to send my parents a formal warning letter, a legal cease and desist that would undoubtedly scare them into stopping their plan before they did something incredibly stupid and destructive. I thought about his offer. I thought about all the countless times they had bailed Cassandra out of trouble. I thought about how they never, ever faced real-world consequences for their terrible actions, and how they always twisted reality to make me the cold-hearted villain. I looked at Mr. Hawthorne and shook my head slowly. "No," I said, my voice completely steady and devoid of emotion. "Do not warn them. A warning will only make them hide it better. Let them do it. Let them sign the papers. Let them commit the fraud on the public record. They need to learn." Mr. Hawthorne looked at me for a long time, understanding the devastating emotional toll this decision would take on my family. But he finally nodded. The trap was set in stone. All I had to do was wait for them to eagerly walk right into it. And now, 6 months later, sitting in my apartment, Cassandra's arrogant text message was the ultimate, undeniable confirmation that the steel jaws of the legal trap had finally snapped shut on their legs. The morning after she sent the photo, I woke up feeling remarkably refreshed, as if a massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I made myself a proper, hearty breakfast of scrambled eggs and black coffee. I took a long shower, dressed in my sharpest, most intimidating tailored corporate suit, and sat down at my pristine kitchen island. I picked up my phone, finally turned off the Do Not Disturb mode, and deliberately initiated a video call to my sister. She answered on the second ring, clearly eager to rub her fake victory in my face. Cassandra was sitting on the beautiful, weathered wooden porch of the estate, holding a steaming cup of gourmet coffee. She looked incredibly smug, radiant, and utterly victorious. "Well, well, well," she chirped, dramatically flipping her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. Look who finally decided to call her sister back. Did you see the amazing news? Mom and Dad realized I am the only one who can properly maintain this massive place. I mean, you are always so incredibly busy with your boring corporate contracts, right? I bought it from the trust for $1. It is the real estate deal of a lifetime. Congratulations, Cassandra, I said, keeping my tone perfectly pleasant and entirely devoid of the sarcasm she was expecting to hear. It really is a beautiful piece of property. Have you started moving your personal things in yet? Oh, absolutely, she beamed proudly, turning the phone camera around to show a thick stack of architectural blueprints resting on a patio table. I have already hired the best contractors in town. We are tearing down this old, creepy wooden porch completely. It is so terribly outdated. I am putting in massive floor-to-ceiling glass panels, a modern luxury infinity pool, and a white marble deck. It is going to be the absolute perfect venue for my wedding next summer. I have already paid the massive non-refundable deposits to the construction crew. I sat in silence and let her ramble on for another 30 seconds, listening to her detail exactly how she was going to erase every single trace of Grandpa's hard work to build her modern, soulless, Instagram-friendly paradise. When she finally paused to take a breath, I leaned significantly closer to the camera. I completely dropped my pleasant smile. My eyes locked intensely onto hers through the digital screen. You bought a $2 million estate for $1, I said very slowly, coldly enunciating every single syllable. That truly is amazing, Cassandra. Tell me something. When Mom and Dad handed you that deed to sign yesterday, did you happen to read the fine print at the bottom? Or, better yet, did any of you bother to call Mr. Hawthorne before you tried to file it with the county clerk? The obnoxious smugness on Cassandra's face froze instantly. Her eyes began to dart around nervously, the slow gears in her head struggling painfully to process the implication of my words. What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice entirely losing its sweet, mocking edge and replacing it with a tremor of fear. Mom and Dad are the trustees. They have the absolute legal right to sell it to whoever they want. We signed the papers in front of a public notary yesterday afternoon. You should really call Mr. Hawthorne right now, I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper of absolute finality. Because your $1 deal is completely dead. And so is your luxury wedding venue. Before she could stutter another single word of protest, I ended the call. I set the phone down on the cold marble counter. Exactly 12 seconds later, my mother's name began flashing violently on my screen, accompanied by an aggressive, desperate vibration. The real panic had officially begun. If you are enjoying this story and want to hear how the ultimate legal trap unfolds, please hit the like button on this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below with the name of the city you are living in. Every single comment helps push this video to more viewers who love a good story of justice. Thank you so much for your support. Now, let's get back to the drama. Following that incredibly brief, devastating video call with Cassandra, my cell phone did not stop ringing for 3 solid, uninterrupted hours. My mother called a staggering 12 times. My father called 8 times. Cassandra sent a relentless barrage of increasingly frantic, panicked text messages. I did not answer a single one of them. Instead, I sat calmly at my computer desk and simply watched the message previews flash across my screen like a desperate ticker tape. My mother's texts went through the classic, predictable stages of narcissistic panic. First came the aggressive denial. Valerie, stop playing these stupid games right now. Your sister is very upset and crying. Then, when the reality started to sink in, came the explosive anger. You are a bitter, jealous sibling. We had every legal right to transfer that property. You cannot stop us. Finally, when they presumably tried to call the county clerk's office and realized the transfer deed had been completely frozen and flagged by the trust's automated legal system, the pathetic bargaining began. Valerie, please pick up the phone immediately. We are family. We can work this out together without involving lawyers. I felt a dark, incredibly cold sense of amusement reading the word family on my screen. They only ever weaponized that specific word when they were the ones in deep trouble and needed a shield. I ignored every single notification. I had one highly proactive piece of business to handle before the real, explosive storm hit tomorrow morning. Cassandra had explicitly mentioned hiring contractors and paying non-refundable deposits. Knowing Cassandra's financial reality, she was deeply in debt and had probably maxed out the last of her credit card limits or begged our parents for cash to secure those workers. I opened my internet browser, quickly searched for the top high-end coastal contractors operating in the Newport area, and found the one specific company that perfectly matched Cassandra's flashy, overly modern aesthetic. I dialed their main office number without hesitation. When the head contractor, a gruff, exhausted-sounding man named Henderson, answered the line, I introduced myself clearly as the legal co-beneficiary of the Harrison Trust. I spoke in my most professional, deeply intimidating corporate lawyer voice, leaving absolutely no room for argument. Mr. Henderson, I understand you have recently been contracted by a woman named Cassandra for major luxury renovations at the Newport estate. I am calling you today as a professional courtesy to inform you that the property in question is currently under a severe, highly active legal dispute regarding a fraudulent title transfer. The client who hired you does not, in fact, own the property she claims to own. If your demolition crews step foot on that land and begin tearing down the porch, you will be held personally liable for the illegal destruction of protected trust property, and all your company's invoices will be frozen in litigation for the next 5 years. There was a heavy, stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of shuffling papers. Are you serious, lady? Henderson finally growled, his voice rising in anger. She showed us a signed deed yesterday. A deed that was officially rejected and flagged as fraudulent by the county clerk this morning. I corrected him smoothly and firmly. I highly advise you to pull your crews immediately and cut your financial losses. Do not let your men touch a single piece of cedar wood on that porch. Henderson cursed loudly under his breath, abruptly thanked me for the legal heads up, and slammed the phone down. I could only begin to imagine the chaotic, screaming phone call Cassandra was about to receive from an incredibly angry contractor demanding his immediate cancellation fees. I walked slowly over to the large window of my apartment, looking out over the gray, sprawling, rainy skyline of Boston. I poured myself a generous glass of expensive red wine, took a slow sip, and smiled at my own reflection in the glass. I had systematically and ruthlessly cut off every single one of their escape routes. Tomorrow morning, we were all formally scheduled to meet at Mr. Hawthorne's downtown office. Tomorrow, my parents and my golden child sister were finally going to learn that playing toxic favorites comes with a very heavy, legally binding price tag. The next morning, the city of Boston was completely engulfed in a torrential downpour, the sky a bruised, angry purple that perfectly mirrored the impending doom my family was about to face. I arrived at Mr. Hawthorne's prestigious downtown law office exactly 15 minutes early. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, my hair pulled back into a severe, professional knot. I wanted them to look at me and see absolutely nothing of the vulnerable 18-year-old girl they had financially abandoned. I wanted them to see a legal executioner. Mr. Hawthorne greeted me with a solemn nod and led me into his massive, oak-paneled conference room. We sat at the far end of the long, polished table, 2 empty legal pads resting in front of us, waiting in absolute silence. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of the conference room burst open. My father marched into the room first, his face flushed a deep, furious crimson. My mother trailed closely behind him, clutching her expensive leather handbag like a defensive shield, her eyes darting nervously around the intimidating room. Finally, Cassandra walked in. She did not look like the smug, victorious influencer from the text message yesterday. She looked utterly, completely terrified, her designer clothes slightly rumpled, her makeup hastily applied. She had clearly just survived the brutal phone call from the contractor I had warned, and the reality of her collapsing house of cards was beginning to show on her pale face. My father did not even bother to sit down. He marched directly to the center of the conference table, reached into his suit jacket, and slammed a crumpled, notarized piece of paper violently onto the polished wood. "What is the meaning of this absolute nonsense, Valerie?" he roared, his voice echoing loudly off the walls. "We are the legal trustees of the Harrison estate. We have the absolute, undeniable parental right to transfer that property to your sister. She needs a stable home to build her future and host her wedding. You have a massive corporate salary. You do not need that old beach house. Now, call the county clerk, drop this ridiculous legal hold, and let the transfer go through immediately." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply picked up my porcelain teacup, took a slow, deliberate sip of Earl Grey, and set it down without making a single sound. I looked at my father, really looked at him, and for the first time in 34 years, I realized he had absolutely no power over me. He was just an angry, foolish man who was completely out of his depth. "I am not the one you need to be speaking to, Dad," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. I gestured smoothly toward the older man sitting next to me. "I suggest you direct your complaints to Grandpa Harrison's attorney." Mr. Hawthorne did not look intimidated by my father's shouting. He had dealt with angry, entitled heirs for 40 years. He calmly adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, reached into his leather briefcase, and pulled out a single, thick red folder. He opened it slowly, flattening the heavy legal parchment on the table. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison," the lawyer began, his voice dry and devoid of any warmth. "I highly suggest you sit down and listen very carefully. Because as of 9 o'clock this morning, you have crossed a legal line that cannot easily be uncrossed. You assumed that being named a trustee gave you the power of an owner. That was a profoundly arrogant and ultimately devastating miscalculation." My mother sank slowly into a leather chair, pulling Cassandra down into the seat next to her. My father remained standing for a moment longer, his jaw clenched tight, but the sheer, unwavering authority in Mr. Hawthorne's voice finally forced him to sit. The air in the room grew incredibly heavy, thick with the sudden realization that they were no longer in control of the narrative. They could not gaslight a legal document. They could not manipulate a binding trust. They were trapped in a room with the consequences of their own toxic favoritism, and the doors had just been firmly locked from the inside. Mr. Hawthorne looked directly at my parents, his expression completely unreadable. "The document you attempted to file with the county yesterday," he stated clearly, tapping his pen against the red folder, "was flagged and immediately rejected by the automated registry system. This is because the Harrison Trust contains a highly specific, deeply buried clause that your father explicitly instructed me to draft. It is called the anti-fraud provision." Cassandra let out a sharp, trembling breath. "Fraud," she squeaked, her voice cracking. "It was not fraud. Mom and Dad signed the papers. They gave it to me for $1. Selling a $2 million estate for $1 without the notarized consent of all listed beneficiaries is the exact legal definition of fiduciary fraud," Mr. Hawthorne corrected her sharply, silencing her instantly. He turned his attention back to my pale father. "The provision dictates that any attempt by the trustees to circumvent the dual ownership clause instantly triggers a series of severe legal penalties. First and foremost, the property immediately falls under the direct, unyielding supervision of the probate court. All trustees, meaning you and your wife, are permanently and irrevocably removed from your positions. You no longer have any right to manage, visit, or make decisions regarding the Newport estate." My mother gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth as tears finally began to well up in her eyes. "No," she whispered, shaking her head frantically. "No, he would not do that. We are his children. We were just trying to help Cassandra secure her future." "Your father anticipated exactly who you were trying to help, and at whose expense," Mr. Hawthorne replied coldly. "But the removal of your trustee status is only the beginning. The provision contains a strict punitive measure directed at anyone who willingly participates in the fraudulent transfer." He shifted his gaze toward my sister, who was now visibly shaking in her chair. "Cassandra, because you actively attempted to acquire the stolen property, you are officially barred from entering or using the estate for 5 full years. If you step one single foot onto that cedar porch, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing. 5 years. Cassandra shrieked, jumping up from her chair, her face twisted in pure, unadulterated panic. You cannot do that. I already told everyone I am hosting my wedding there next summer. I sent out the save the dates. I hired the best contractors to build my pool. My whole life is planned around that house. You should have checked the deed first, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the lawyer began reading. Cassandra spun around to face me, her eyes completely wild. You did this, she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. You set me up. You knew this would happen, and you let me sign the papers anyway. I did not force you to steal my inheritance, Cassandra, I replied, my voice as cold and hard as a glacier. I simply stopped standing in your way. You and Mom and Dad built this bomb all by yourselves. I just sat back and let you push the detonator. My mother slid out of her chair and actually fell to her knees onto the carpeted floor of the conference room. She reached out, trying to grab my hand, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. Valerie, please, she sobbed, completely abandoning her pride. Why are you doing this to us? We only wanted to secure your sister's future. You have your massive career, you have your success, you do not need that old house. She needs this more than you do. Please, drop the legal hold. Forgive us. I looked down at the woman who had drained my college fund to buy her favorite daughter out of a juvenile hit and run. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity. No sadness. Just a hollow, empty quiet. That is exactly the problem, Mom, I replied, pulling my hand away from her grasp. You have spent 34 years ensuring Cassandra's future at my absolute expense. But Grandpa saw it coming. That is why he protected me from you. Mr. Hawthorne cleared his throat loudly, cutting through the sounds of my mother's sobbing. There is one final item, he announced. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed, slightly yellowed envelope. Your father left a letter. To be opened only if the anti-fraud provision was ever triggered. Mr. Hawthorne carefully broke the heavy wax seal on the yellowed envelope. The sound echoed loudly in the painfully quiet conference room. My father, who had been staring blankly at the wall, slowly turned his head. My mother stopped sobbing, still kneeling on the floor, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and shame. Cassandra shrank back into her large leather chair, looking like a scolded child. Mr. Hawthorne unfolded the thick parchment paper, adjusted his glasses, and began to read Grandpa Harrison's final words aloud. To my family, the letter began, the words carrying the unmistakable, gruff tone of the man I loved so dearly. If you are reading this letter, then my absolute worst fears have been completely realized. You have attempted to illegally deny Valerie her rightful inheritance, likely believing in your twisted logic that you were acting in Cassandra's best interests. But true parental love does not mean favoring one child while ruthlessly sacrificing the other. It does not mean continuously shielding a child from the consequences of her own terrible actions. I have watched you ruin both my granddaughters. You raised Cassandra to believe the entire world owes her a living, and you raised Valerie to believe she is entirely unloved. My father let out a choked, ragged sound, burying his face tightly in his hands. Grandpa's words were hitting him harder than any legal document ever could. The letter continued. Valerie, Mr. Hawthorne read, his voice softening just a fraction. You have my strength. You have my backbone. I know you will fight them when it matters. And Cassandra, beneath all your flashy arrogance, I truly hope you have a good heart. Someday, I pray both of you will understand what actually matters in this short life. Until then, I have legally ensured you have a place to come home to, whenever you are finally ready to find your way back to being real sisters. Mr. Hawthorne finished reading and slowly folded the letter. The silence in the room was absolutely deafening. The sheer arrogance that had fueled my parents for over 3 decades was completely gone, shattered into a million pieces by the voice of a ghost. Cassandra was crying silently, her face buried in her hands, the illusion of her perfect life entirely stripped away. For the first time in my 34 years of existence, I held all the cards. I could completely ruin them. I could walk away, let the court banish them for 5 years, and never speak to them again. But as I looked at their broken, pathetic figures, I realized that true revenge was not about destruction. It was about forcing them to finally wake up. The 5-year ban is legally binding, I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet room. They all looked up at me, their eyes filled with absolute dread. However, I continued, as the sole remaining beneficiary in good standing, I have the legal authority to formally petition the court to waive the ban. But I will only do it under 3 absolute, non-negotiable conditions. My father looked at me with desperate, pleading eyes. Anything, he whispered hoarsely. Name it, Valerie. I took a deep breath. First, Cassandra will completely repay the contractor's cancellation fees out of her own pocket. Not a single cent of Mom and Dad's money will be used. Second, we will establish a formal, legally binding co-ownership agreement that prevents anyone from making changes to the house without written permission. And third, I paused, making sure to look directly into my mother's eyes. All 3 of you will attend intensive, weekly psychological family therapy. You are going to sit in a room with a professional and you are going to dissect every single toxic decision you have made for the past 30 years. If you miss one single session, the 5-year ban is immediately reinstated. Do we have a deal? They nodded frantically, completely and utterly defeated. They signed the preliminary agreements with shaking hands. But as I watched them leave the office, looking like hollow ghosts of the arrogant people who had walked in, I knew the hardest part was yet to come. Signing a legal document to save their reputation was one thing. But walking into a therapist's office and actually facing the ugly demons they had created? That was going to be absolute hell. The first month of mandatory family therapy was an absolute, unmitigated nightmare. I had selected Dr. Eris, a highly recommended, incredibly sharp psychologist who specialized in narcissistic family dynamics and toxic enmeshment. His office was located in a quiet, unassuming brick building in the city, far away from the flashy neighborhoods my family preferred. We sat in a tight circle of comfortable armchairs, the physical distance between us feeling like a massive, unbridgeable ocean. During the first 3 sessions, my parents heavily utilized their classic defense mechanisms. My father sat rigidly with his arms crossed, aggressively deflecting any blame by claiming he worked hard to provide financially. My mother played the absolute victim, crying softly and insisting that every single toxic decision she ever made was simply out of a deep, overwhelming motherly love. But Dr. Eris was a master at his craft. He did not let them hide behind their practice tears. He methodically cornered my mother during the 4th week. "You keep using the word love, Mrs. Harrison," Dr. Eris said, his voice calm but incredibly firm. "But rescuing an adult child from every consequence is not love. It is control. You constantly bailed Cassandra out of massive debts and failed businesses because it made you feel completely indispensable. You needed to be desperately needed. And you punished Valerie for her independence because she did not require your rescuing. Her self-sufficiency made you feel completely useless." My mother stopped crying instantly. Her face went completely pale, her mouth slightly open. For the very first time, the ugly, undeniable truth had been spoken out loud in front of everyone. She could not gaslight the doctor. She could not manipulate the narrative. She simply stared at her lap, her hands trembling violently. Then, Dr. Eris turned his sharp focus onto my sister. Cassandra had spent the first few weeks rolling her eyes, staring at her phone, and acting like she was being tortured. But when the doctor asked her directly why she felt the desperate need to buy a $2 million house for $1, her arrogant facade completely crumbled. "Because I have absolutely nothing," Cassandra suddenly screamed, her voice cracking with genuine, raw panic. "I am 30 years old, and I have nothing. I have $60,000 in secret credit card debt. My latest consulting business is completely bankrupt. Every single friend I have on social media is buying houses and getting married, and I am a complete failure. When Mom and Dad offered me the house, I just wanted to feel successful for 5 minutes. I just wanted to post a picture so people would think I was finally doing better than Valerie." The admission hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She had finally admitted it. It was never about the beach house. It was never about family history. It was entirely about her crippling insecurity and her desperate need to win a competition I had stopped playing 16 years ago. I sat back in my chair and finally let the anger out. I did not yell. I did not scream. I just spoke with a cold, terrifying clarity. I detailed exactly how it felt to work overnight shifts smelling like grease while they bought her a new car. I detailed the profound isolation of graduating law school completely alone because they were busy flying to Paris to comfort Cassandra over a bad breakup. I unloaded 34 years of compressed, heavy trauma right onto the floor of that small office. And for the first time in my entire life, my parents sat in absolute, stunned silence. They did not interrupt. They did not defend themselves. They just listened to the monster they had created. The legal trap had broken their bank accounts, but the therapy was finally breaking their toxic delusions. While my family was being systematically broken down and painfully rebuilt in Dr. Eris's office every single Tuesday, the Newport estate sat completely empty. Mr. Hawthorne had finalized the co-ownership paperwork, officially restoring my rights and cementing the legal boundaries, but none of us had actually visited the property since the explosive showdown. It felt like a massive crime scene, a place heavy with the lingering ghosts of our recent war. But 6 weeks after the therapy began, on a cold, incredibly foggy Saturday morning, I woke up with an overwhelming need to see the house. I drove the 2 hours from Boston to Newport entirely alone in my car, listening to the rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers. When my tires finally crunched onto the familiar gravel driveway, a wave of profound sadness washed over me. The massive cedar house stood silent against the gray backdrop of the turbulent Atlantic Ocean. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped inside. The air was stale, completely lacking the usual warm smell of Grandpa's pipe tobacco and salt. I slowly walked through the rooms, assessing the physical damage. The contractors Cassandra had hired before I shut them down had already started their preliminary demolition. They had violently ripped down the beautiful, vintage floral wallpaper in the main hallway, leaving behind ugly, jagged strips of bare plaster. They had forcefully pried up a large section of the historic hardwood flooring in the living room, exposing the raw, unfinished subfloor beneath. The heavy wooden chessboard Grandpa and I used to play on was pushed carelessly into a dark corner, covered in a thick layer of white plaster dust. I stood in the center of the ruined living room, wrapping my heavy coat tighter around myself. I had won the war. I had legally completely destroyed their fraudulent scheme. I had forced them into therapy and made them face their demons. But looking around at the damaged walls and the dusty floors, I felt an incredibly heavy, suffocating exhaustion. The house was broken, perfectly mirroring the shattered state of my family. I had used a ruthless legal trap to burn their toxic dynamic to the ground, but I was now standing in the ashes, wondering if anything green could ever possibly grow here again. Was the revenge truly worth the immense emotional toll? Was I destined to just own half of a ruined house with a sister I barely knew? I walked out onto the wraparound cedar porch. The freezing ocean wind whipped my hair around my face. I sat down heavily on the top wooden step, staring blindly out at the crashing gray waves. I remembered Grandpa Harrison telling me that sometimes you have to tear a rotten structure down to the foundation before you can build something that will actually survive a storm. But tearing it down was the easy part. The rebuilding was what required true strength. I was sitting there, completely lost in my dark thoughts, tracing a deep scratch in the wooden floorboards with my fingernail, when I suddenly heard a sound over the crashing waves. It was the distinct crunch of tires slowly rolling onto the gravel driveway. I turned my head, tensing up defensively. A small, incredibly beat-up compact car, definitely not the luxury SUV my parents usually drove, pulled to a stop near the garage. The driver's side door creaked open slowly. I stood up, bracing myself for whatever argument was about to happen. Cassandra stepped out of the cheap compact car. I stared at her, genuinely shocked by her appearance. She was not wearing her usual designer labels or expensive jewelry. She wore a faded gray, oversized sweatshirt, worn-out denim jeans, and her hair was pulled up into a messy, completely unstyled bun. She looked incredibly exhausted, the dark circles under her eyes visible even from the driveway. She walked slowly toward the porch, her shoulders slumped, lacking all of her usual arrogant, camera-ready posture. She stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps, looking up at me tentatively. "I saw your car parked on the street," she said, her voice quiet and completely devoid of its usual demanding edge. "I hope it is okay that I stopped by. I am technically not banned anymore, right?" "You are not banned," I replied neutrally, keeping my distance. "What are you doing here, Cassandra? We do not have therapy until Tuesday." She let out a heavy sigh and reached into the front pocket of her sweatshirt. She pulled out a small, folded piece of paper and slowly walked up the steps, holding it out to me. "I came to give you this," she said softly. I took the paper and unfolded it. It was a certified cashier's check made out to the general contractor, Mr. Henderson. The amount perfectly covered the extensive cancellation fees and the preliminary demolition damage. I looked at the name on the account. It was Cassandra's personal checking account. "I sold my designer bags," she explained, looking down at her scuffed sneakers. "I sold my expensive watch, my clothes, everything that had any resale value. I drained the last $800 in my savings account to cover the rest. It is exactly what I owe them for ruining the house. No money from Mom and Dad." I stared at the check, genuinely stunned. For 30 years, Cassandra had never paid for her own mistakes. She had never sacrificed a single luxury to make amends. This small piece of paper represented a massive, fundamental shift in her reality. "Cassandra," I started, not entirely sure what to say. "I am sorry," she interrupted, her voice finally breaking. Tears welled up in her tired eyes, but she did not wipe them away. "I am so incredibly sorry, Valerie. For the house. For the college fund. For constantly making you feel like you were the enemy just because you were actually strong enough to survive without them. Dr. Eris was right. I was drowning, and instead of learning how to swim, I just kept trying to push your head under the water to keep myself afloat. It was pathetic, and it was cruel. It was the first completely honest, undefensive apology she had ever given me. There were no excuses. There was no gaslighting. Just raw, painful accountability." I looked at my younger sister, really looked at her, and saw the frightened, insecure girl she had been hiding behind a wall of fake influencer photos for a decade. The heavy armor of resentment I had worn for 16 years suddenly felt a little bit lighter. "The kitchen is still a complete disaster area," I said softly, carefully folding the check and putting it into my pocket. "But I think the old gas stove still works. Do you remember Grandpa Harrison's exact recipe for hot chocolate?" Cassandra looked up, surprise flickering across her tear-stained face. A tiny, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. "Real melted cocoa, heavy cream, and a pinch of sea salt," she whispered. "Exactly," I nodded, stepping aside to let her walk through the front door. "Come inside. Let's see if we can find a clean pot in this mess." We sat on the dusty floor of the ruined kitchen for 2 hours, drinking hot chocolate out of mismatched ceramic mugs. We did not talk about the legal trap, or the therapy, or our parents. We just talked about the ocean, about the memories of Grandpa, and about how incredibly hard it is to figure out who you actually are when you strip away everyone else's expectations. We could not magically erase the past 16 years of intense trauma in one afternoon. But looking at the broken floorboards and the torn wallpaper, we both quietly realized that we finally had a completely blank slate. We could start fixing the house, and maybe, just maybe, we could start fixing ourselves. The following year was not a cinematic montage of magical healing. It was agonizingly slow, incredibly frustrating, and filled with intense physical and emotional labor. We made a strict, binding rule: absolutely no professional contractors were allowed back onto the property. If the Newport estate was going to be repaired, we were going to repair it with our own hands. We spent nearly every single weekend that spring and summer covered in a thick layer of sawdust, paint splatter, and sweat. The physical labor became a direct extension of our psychological therapy. Cassandra and I spent 3 exhausting weekends on our hands and knees, painstakingly sanding down the damaged hardwood floors in the living room. It was brutal work. My shoulders ached, and Cassandra's previously manicured hands were covered in rough calluses and small blisters. But during those long hours of mindless sanding, the real conversations happened. We fought, we cried, we yelled about past grievances, and then we calmly painted the walls together. She learned how to use a power drill properly, and I learned how to actually listen to her fears without immediately judging her as the spoiled golden child. Our parents' transformation was much slower and far more awkward, but they were genuinely trying. The intense therapy sessions had permanently shattered their toxic worldview. My father stopped throwing money at problems and started trying to actually offer emotional support. He drove up on weekends to help us replace the cedar siding, quietly taking instructions from Cassandra on how she wanted the trim painted. He did not boss us around, he simply worked. My mother, who had the hardest time letting go of her desperate need to control everything, started showing her love in much smaller, healthier ways. She stopped buying Cassandra expensive, flashy gifts to win her affection. Instead, she brought homemade sandwiches and iced tea to the house while we worked, sitting on the porch and just quietly watching us rebuild. She was slowly learning how to be a parent to two adult women, rather than a rescuer to a perpetual child. The biggest breakthrough happened in late August. Cassandra had finally completely abandoned her fake influencer lifestyle. With a newly humbled perspective, she took an entry-level, unglamorous job doing social media management for a small, local bakery in the city. It paid a fraction of what she was used to spending, but it was honest, steady work. One Saturday afternoon, while we were cleaning out the dusty, spider-infested boathouse down by the dock, we uncovered Grandpa Harrison's old wooden sailboat. It was covered in a thick tarp, the wood completely dry and the rigging tangled. Cassandra looked at the boat, then looked at me. "Do you think we can make it float again?" she asked, wiping a streak of dirt off her forehead. "It is going to take months to patch that hull," I warned her, inspecting the deep cracks in the wood. "I have time," she smiled, grabbing a piece of heavy grit sandpaper. And she did. We spent the entire autumn restoring that boat. Cassandra did the tedious, incredibly boring work of patching the fiberglass, never once complaining about ruining her clothes. When we finally pushed the small boat into the freezing Atlantic water in November, and the hull actually held without leaking a single drop, Cassandra cried. But this time, they were not tears of manipulation or panic. They were tears of genuine, hard-earned pride. She had built something real, something that did not require our parents' money or my legal intervention. The house was slowly coming back to life, and so was she. Exactly 1 year after the explosive legal showdown in Mr. Hawthorne's office, the four of us were sitting on the newly restored wraparound porch of the Newport estate. The sun was setting over the Atlantic Ocean, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and deep purple. The house looked completely different now. It was not the flashy, modern monstrosity Cassandra had originally planned, nor was it exactly the way Grandpa had left it. It was a perfect, comfortable blend of our shared history and our new reality. My father was quietly tending to the barbecue grill, while my mother was inside the kitchen, laughing easily about something without that old, nervous tension in her voice. Cassandra was sitting next to me on the porch swing, holding a glass of cheap wine that she had bought with her own paycheck. Earlier that afternoon, she had excitedly showed me a formal letter from a local bank. She had been officially approved for a small business loan to expand her marketing services. It was a real loan, based entirely on her own credit and hard work, with absolutely zero family money involved. I had never been more incredibly proud of her. "I have a surprise for you," Cassandra suddenly said, setting her wine glass down. She reached behind the pillows of the porch swing and pulled out a worn, leather-bound book. I instantly recognized the faded gold lettering on the cover. It was Grandpa Harrison's personal journal. "I found it hidden in the attic last weekend while I was insulating the roof," she explained softly, handing it to me. I read the last entry. "I think he wrote it the same week he met with Mr. Hawthorne to set up the legal trap. You need to read it, Valerie." I took the heavy journal. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the crisp, yellowed pages to the bookmark she had left. Grandpa's familiar, sharp handwriting filled the page. "I look at my two beautiful granddaughters today," the entry read. "They are so incredibly different, yet both so vital. I worry deeply about the toxic patterns forming in their parents' behavior. They are building a house of cards that will eventually collapse and crush both girls. But I also have immense hope. Valerie has my stubborn backbone. I know she will fight ruthlessly when it truly matters. And Cassandra, beneath all that desperate flash, has a truly good heart that just needs to be challenged. Someday, they will both understand what really matters. But to fix a badly broken bone, a doctor must sometimes re-break it first. I am leaving Valerie the legal hammer to break the illusion. It will be painful. It will be a terrible war. But I know she has the strength to swing it, and I know they have the strength to survive it. I will make sure they have a standing place to rebuild when the war is finally over. I closed the journal, pulling it tightly against my chest. A single tear escaped and rolled down my cheek. He knew. Grandpa Harrison knew exactly how brutal the fallout would be, but he trusted me to execute the harsh justice our family desperately needed to survive. He provided the legal trap, but he trusted us to actually do the healing. Cassandra leaned over and rested her head gently on my shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered into the cold ocean wind. "Thank you for stopping the sale. Thank you for completely breaking my reality. It saved my life." I wrapped my arm around my sister, watching the final rays of the sun dip below the dark horizon. We were not a perfect family. We still had bad days, and the scars of the past 34 years would never completely fade away. But sitting on that porch, listening to the steady rhythm of the waves, I finally felt something I had not felt since I was a little girl. I felt like I was actually home. So, that is my entire story. I could have completely destroyed her financially. I could have walked away from my toxic family forever and never looked back. But I chose the agonizing, incredibly hard path of forcing them to face the ugly truth. Was I entirely wrong to hold their feet to the fire? Was my legal trap too harsh, or should I have just let the law banish them from the estate completely? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming dramatic stories. See you in the next one.